The 1872 Diamond Hoax. How two men fooled the world's richest bankers. In the spring of 1872, two rough-looking prospectors walked into the Bank of California in San Francisco, carrying a leather bag. They looked like typical frontiermen, weathered, dusty, and clearly uncomfortable in the marble-floored elegance of one of America's most prestigious financial institutions. But what they carried in that bag would trigger one of the greatest financial frauds in American history. Philip Arnold and John Slack claimed they had discovered something extraordinary, a remote field literally carpeted with diamonds, rubies, sapphires, and emeralds. They had, they said, stumbled upon the greatest gemstone deposit in North America, perhaps in the world, and they were willing to let investors in on the opportunity for the right price. Within months, some of the wealthiest and most sophisticated financiers in America, men who had built fortunes in railroads, mining, and banking, would be falling over themselves to invest millions of dollars in the diamond fields. These weren't naive yokels or gullible amateurs. These were titans of the Gilded Age, men whose business acumen had made them rich beyond imagination, and two Kentucky cousins with a bag of industrial diamonds and nerves of steel would fool them all. The men behind the scheme. Philip Arnold was born in Kentucky in 1826, the son of a farmer. He learned the basics of mining in his youth, but wasn't content with small-scale operations. By the 1860s, he was in California, working as a bookkeeper for the Diamond Drill Company in San Francisco. It was a position that gave him insight into both the mining industry and the minds of investors always seeking the next big strike. His cousin, John Slack, was cut from similar cloth, a working-class man with mining experience and limited prospect for wealth through legitimate means. Both men had watched others get rich from gold and silver strikes while they remained wage laborers. They were smart enough to understand geology, experienced enough to know how mines operated, and desperate enough to attempt a massive fraud. The genius of their scheme was its simplicity. The American West in the 1870s was still relatively unexplored. Newspapers regularly reported fantastic mineral discoveries in remote locations. The idea that a field of diamonds might exist somewhere in the vast territories wasn't inherently absurd. It was exactly the kind of thing investors wanted to believe. Arnold and Slack's plan was to create evidence of such a field, let that evidence speak for itself, and then sell their stake for a fortune before anyone discovered the truth. Planting the seeds. The cousins began their scheme by purchasing rough industrial diamonds. These weren't the polished gems you'd see in jewelry stores. They were uncut stones used in drilling equipment, the kind Arnold would have had access to through his work. They weren't particularly valuable, and because they were industrial grade, they could be bought in bulk without arousing suspicion. They also acquired rubies, sapphires, and emeralds, mixing gemstones in a way that should have immediately raised red flags to anyone with geological knowledge. In nature, diamonds form under completely different conditions than rubies or emeralds. Finding them all in the same deposit would be like finding penguins and polar bears living together, a sign that something was very wrong. But Arnold and Slack were counting on greed overriding skepticism. In early 1872, they made their first approach to investors. They didn't come in aggressively selling. That would have seemed suspicious. Instead, they played it coy, suggesting they had made a discovery but weren't sure what to do with it. They acted like simple prospectors who had stumbled onto something big but needed sophisticated partners to properly develop the claim. They approached George Roberts, a prominent San Francisco businessman, showing him a few rough gemstones as samples. Roberts was intrigued but cautious. He introduced Arnold and Slack to other investors, including mining magnate William Ralston, founder of the Bank of California, and one of the wealthiest men on the West Coast. The bait Ralston and his associates wanted proof. Arnold and Slack, maintaining their pose as unsophisticated prospectors, agreed to take a small group to see the diamond field, but only under strict conditions. The investors would have to wear blindfolds during parts of the journey so the location remained secret. Arnold and Slack couldn't risk someone recognizing the terrain or being able to retrace the route. The chosen location was in northwestern Colorado, though accounts sometimes placed it in Wyoming or Arizona. Arnold and Slack deliberately kept the location vague. It was remote, accessible only by a difficult overland journey in territory that was still largely unmapped. Perfect for a hoax. Before the inspection trip, Arnold and Slack made a secret journey to the site and salted it, scattering their industrial diamonds and other gemstones across the ground. They didn't just toss them randomly. They carefully placed stones in crevices, partially buried them in soil, and distributed them in patterns that would seem natural to non-geologists. They made it look like erosion had exposed gems from a deeper deposit. In June 1872, Arnold and Slack led a small group of investors, including mining engineer David Colton, to the site. When they arrived and began looking around, it seemed their claims were true. Diamonds glittered in the dirt. Rubies could be found in rock crevices. Within minutes, the investors were finding gemstones everywhere they looked. Colton, despite his mining expertise, was completely taken in. He reported back to Ralston that the diamond field was genuine, one of the greatest mineral discoveries in American history. The feeding frenzied news of the diamond discovery spread through San Francisco's financial circles like wildfire. Investors clamored to get in on the ground floor. Ralston and his partners formed the San Francisco and New York Mining and Commercial Company, capitalized at $10 million, an astronomical sum in 1872, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. The list of investors read like a who's who of Gilded Age wealth. William Ralston, Baron Rothschild's representative, former Union Army General George McClellan, prominent New York financiers, all of them bought into the scheme. Charles Tiffany, founder of Tiffany and Company, examined some of the stones and declared them genuine diamonds worth a fortune. Arnold and Slack played their role perfectly. They acted reluctant to sell as though they weren't sure they wanted partners at all. This made investors more eager, more willing to pay premium prices for stakes in the company. The cousins negotiated shrewdly, eventually selling most of their interest for $600,000, about $15 million in today's money. Philip Arnold took his share and returned to Kentucky, buying a large estate and living like a gentleman. John Slack also disappeared with his fortune, fading into comfortable obscurity. They had pulled off one of the great cons in American history, but they had made one critical mistake. They had attracted too much attention. The skeptic Clarence King was one of the most brilliant geologists in America. At just 30 years old, he was director of the United States Geological Survey of the 40th Parallel, conducting scientific mapping of the Western Territories. He was also methodical, skeptical, and unwilling to accept extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence. When King heard about the diamond field, something bothered him. He had spent years surveying the exact regions where diamonds were supposedly being found, and he had never seen any geological indicators that would suggest diamond deposits. The rock formations were all wrong. The geological conditions didn't fit. Moreover, the presence of diamonds, rubies, sapphires, and emeralds in the same location was geologically impossible. These gems form under completely different conditions. Diamonds deep in the Earth's mantle under extreme pressure, rubies and sapphires in metamorphic rocks, emeralds in hydrothermal veins. Finding them together was like finding seashells on a mountaintop, a sign of human intervention, not natural geology. King convinced his team to investigate. Using clues from the investors' descriptions and his own knowledge of Western geography, he narrowed down possible locations. In October 1872, King and his team arrived at the supposed diamond field. It didn't take long to confirm his suspicions. The unraveling King and his geologists found diamonds, but they found them in ways that immediately revealed the fraud. Diamonds appeared in ant hills, a geological impossibility since ants bring material up from underground and diamonds form far deeper than ants could ever dig. Stones were found on the surface with no signs of the erosion that would have naturally exposed them. The distribution pattern was random, not following any geological structure. Most damning of all, King found a diamond that had clearly been cut and polished before being planted in the ground. Someone had scattered finished gems, not natural rough stones. The entire field had been salted. King immediately returned to San Francisco and reported his findings to the investors. The response was initially disbelief. Surely King must be mistaken. These were sophisticated businessmen who had done their due diligence. They had hired experts. They had seen the diamonds themselves. But King's evidence was irrefutable. He brought samples, photographs, and geological analysis that proved beyond doubt that the diamond field was a fraud. The investors had been spectacularly, expensively fooled. The aftermath. The revelation sent shock waves through San Francisco's financial community. The San Francisco and New York mining and commercial company collapsed instantly. Investors lost millions. Reputations were ruined. William Ralston's Bank of California teetered on the edge of collapse. He had been so confident in the diamond field that he had personally guaranteed much of the investment. Legal efforts to recover the money from Arnold and Slack largely failed. Arnold had returned to Kentucky, where he hired excellent lawyers who argued that he had never explicitly guaranteed the diamonds were naturally occurring. He had simply sold his interest in a mining claim. It was a technical defense, but it worked. Arnold eventually settled for about $150,000, keeping most of his fortune. John Slack was never found. He had taken his money and disappeared completely, possibly changing his name and starting over somewhere with no connections to his past. He had pulled off the perfect crime, stealing a fortune and vanishing without a trace. The scandal became a cautionary tale about greed and gullibility. Newspapers across the country covered the story with a mixture of outrage and schadenfreude. How could the wealthiest, most sophisticated investors in America be so thoroughly duped by two Kentucky prospectors? Why it worked. The Great Diamond Hoax succeeded for several psychological and historical reasons. First, the 1870s were a time of genuine mineral discoveries in the American West. Gold rushes, silver strikes, and copper deposits had made fortunes seemingly overnight. The idea of a diamond field wasn't inherently implausible in that context. Second, Arnold and Slack understood that people see what they want to see. The investors desperately wanted to believe in the diamond field because it represented astronomical profits. This confirmation bias made them willing to overlook warning signs and accept evidence that should have seemed suspicious. Third, the con men played their roles perfectly. They didn't oversell. They acted reluctant, skeptical of their own discovery, which made them seem more credible. When investors found diamonds at the site, they believed their own eyes rather than questioning whether someone might have planted evidence. Fourth, even the experts failed. Mining engineers, gemologists, and experienced businessmen all examined the evidence and declared it genuine. This created a cascade of credibility. If the experts believed it, why shouldn't everyone else? Finally, the sheer scale of the operation gave it credibility. A small scam might seem suspicious, but a $10 million company with dozens of wealthy investors? That seemed too big, too public, to be fraudulent. Lessons that still resonate. The 1872 Diamond Hoax offers lessons that remain relevant today. Financial fraud hasn't disappeared. It's simply evolved. From the Ponzi schemes of the 1920s to the Enron scandal of 2001 to cryptocurrency frauds in recent years, the basic pattern remains the same. Create something that appears valuable, convince people to invest, and disappear before the truth emerges. The psychology Arnold and Slack exploited: greed, confirmation bias, herd mentality, trust in experts, still drives investment bubbles and scams. People still see what they want to see, especially when vast profits are at stake. Clarence King's skeptical scientific approach also offers a lesson. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. When something seems too good to be true, it probably is. When the geology doesn't make sense, when the patterns don't fit, when the experts disagree, these are warning signs that should be investigated, not ignored. The end of the story. Philip Arnold lived out his life in Kentucky as a wealthy gentleman farmer. He died in 1878, shot in an altercation with a rival banker, not over the diamond hoax, but over a completely unrelated business dispute. He was 52 years old and still rich from his fraudulent scheme. John Slack's fate remains unknown. He simply vanished into history, taking his secrets with him. William Ralston's Bank of California survived the scandal, but never fully recovered its reputation. Ralston himself died in 1875, drowning in San Francisco Bay under circumstances that were ruled accidental, but suspected by some to be suicide. Clarence King became famous as the man who exposed the hoax, cementing his reputation as one of America's greatest geologists. He continued his work with the U.S. Geological Survey and later became its first director when the agency was formally established in 1879. The diamond field itself, the remote Colorado location where Arnold and Slack planted their gems, is now known, but holds no marker or monument. It's just another piece of Western landscape, notable only to historians and curiosity seekers who know the story of the greatest con in Gilded Age America. Conclusion: the perfect crime. The great diamond hoax of 1872 was, in its way, perfect. Arnold and Slack stole millions from some of the richest, most powerful men in America and largely got away with it. They exposed the folly of unchecked greed and the danger of believing what you want to believe. Their scheme worked because they understood human nature better than their victims understood geology. They knew that wealthy men, for all their sophistication, could be just as gullible as anyone else when presented with the promise of even greater wealth. In the end, only Clarence King's scientific skepticism prevented the fraud from continuing even longer. His insistence on evidence, on geological logic, on questioning the consensus, these saved investors from losing even more money and preserved at least some credibility for American financial institutions. The two Kentucky cousins who walked into the Bank of California with a bag of industrial diamonds proved that sometimes the simplest schemes are the most effective. All it takes is nerve, some preparation, and an understanding that people, no matter how smart or wealthy, will believe what they want to believe. The diamonds, of course, were fake, but the fortune Arnold and Slack walked away with was very, very real.